All right, so this is going to be our last 7 notes on Chapter 8. Hope everybody's having a wonderful Friday so far. Of course, you guys in first period just started, so it's probably not that great. But for the rest of you, hopefully it's going to be a good day. So what's going to make it an even better day is that we're going to get more notes on Chapter 8, which is sweet. So we'll go ahead and get right to it here in a second. Remember, your test is going to be on Monday. Packet for Chapter 8 due Monday. If you have any questions about anything before the test, send me an email or come see me Monday morning. I'll try to be there by about 7:30 on Monday morning. So if you have questions about the test, we can do that. I went over much of the stuff with you in class on Tuesday, so you should have a lot of the topics that are going to be on the test already. So today we're going to talk about kind of a couple more points from Chapter 8, the stuff that I mentioned that you might see on the test that we hadn't covered yet. Yesterday we got the Missouri Compromise, and that was really significant. Today we'll get a couple other significant things here. So anyway, we'll go ahead and get right to it with our Bellbrook colors. All right, so the revival of opposition. Okay, so what the revival of opposition is going to be talking about here is reviving opposition. That's why I call it the revival of opposition, or the revival of opposition political parties. We haven't had that since the fall of the Federalist Party. Arguably, since about 1800, realistically, since about 1814. So here we are in the year 1824. James Monroe's presidency has gone really good. We're bouncing back from the panic of 1819 and the economic chows that happened as a result. I think that ride at Cedar Point eventually rebounded, but I haven't been there in a minute, so whatever. So when we're talking about this, we're talking about new political party divisions. And what this is going to result in is kind of the second party system, or third party system, depending on what you want to call it. But before we get to that, let's kind of explain what happens here. So pictured here, this handsome devil down here is President John Quincy Adams, sitting there with a book and need for a shave. So anyway, we'll talk a little bit about this. So we're seeing the emergence of new political ideologies, even though there's only one party. There's only the Democratic Republicans that are still officially active. There are only national political party. But we're seeing kind of lines being drawn within the party because they're disagreeing over things. They disagree on how the country should expand, what areas should be open to slavery, what areas shouldn't. Some are unhappy about the Missouri Compromise. Some are unhappy about any number of things. And we're seeing that sectional divide come in too. Southerners, of course, support slavery and want to see it expanded to more places. Northerners, same old dance, are moving more towards abolition, and they don't want to see the expansion of slavery too much. So that's where that leaves us. It leaves us a party that's very divided. You see a lot of the same stuff today, but this one's a little bit more serious because there's not really an opposition party, But today you have the Republicans, you've got the Trump Republicans, and you got the guys that don't like Trump, and you've got the Democrats, and then you've got kind of like the Bernie Sanders people who are a little more to the left. So you always kind of have divisions within the party. But here, since there's only one party, those divisions are pretty significant. So let's talk for a minute about John Quincy Adams. John Quincy Adams, of course, is the son of John Adams. And John Quincy Adams is a really interesting figure in American history, and his presidency turns out to be very similar to that of his father's. John Quincy Adams I don't know how they get this information or whatever, but I read something that John Quincy Adams is the smartest president we've ever had, actually the highest measured IQ of any president we've ever had. Now, he was president in the 1820s, so I don't know how IQ tests worked back then or whatever. But so anyway, people say John Quincy Adams was the smartest president ever. Now, he was definitely a smart guy, and he was particularly skilled when it came to foreign policy. If you remember, it was John Quincy Adams that was the chief architect or the chief writer of the Monroe Doctrine. So he played a significant role in foreign policy in that regard. It was John Quincy Adams who had a very successful political career after the presidency. In fact, he's the only president in American history that after he was president, he went back to Congress and became a member of Congress again. In fact, in 1848, I think it was, while giving a speech on the floor of Congress about Native American rights, of all things, he had a heart attack and died on the floor of Congress. And that was the end of John Quincy Adams. But really a impressive American political career, but a presidency that had its fair share of problems. So, and we'll get into that shortly. So before we get into that, I want to talk about some another important event, foreign policy event, in the career of John Quincy Adams, which is the Adams-Onis Treaty. So the Adams-Onis Treaty was a treaty with the Spanish, treaty with Spain, and this is how the United States acquired, that's AG. Okay, let's go to that old eraser. Boom, 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 boom. And the Adams-Onis Treaty is how the United States will just say got Florida. So this is 1819, and this is a big acquisition. How do we get Florida? Well, it's pretty good diplomacy on our part. It was another big win for the United States. You see, the great thing about the early leaders of the U.S., have you noticed yet? We're in Chapter 8 now, and it seems like every time we send diplomats to go work out a deal about getting land, we get a ton of land, right? The Peace of Paris that was made after the Revolutionary War. We got all that continental interior. The Louisiana Purchase, obviously. We have very skilled diplomats that make it seem like a really good idea for these foreign countries to sell us the land that they control in America. So the Spanish are having all kinds of problems with Florida, particularly with Native Americans. And this is how the United States acquires Florida. Now, what had happened in the years following the War of 1812 was something called the Seminole War. And that was in like 1816 to 1819 officially, I think, but that doesn't matter. And in the Seminole War, Andrew Jackson, who we know hates Native Americans, goes and just kind of whips the natives down there. And Quincy Adams uses that kind of indirectly as a way of saying, if we really wanted to go down into Florida and take it from you, Spain, we probably could. So how about you just sell it to us? At this time, by 1819, 1820, Spain is weakening as an empire, and they're really looking for reasons to kind of offload the lands they acquire, or the lands they had acquired so long ago. So we use this skillful diplomacy again on the part of Adams in acquiring Florida, and in exchange, we basically give Spain some of the land that would eventually become Texas. They wanted that to be part of what they called New Spain. And then ironically, not long after that, I think only like 3 months later, Mexico got their independence from Spain, and all that land Spain loses again because it becomes part of Mexico. So we basically gave away nothing, and we gain all the land that is Florida. And so now the whole eastern seaboard is now controlled by the United States, which is a big get for us, which is a big thing, because without Florida, we don't have Disney World, we don't have places that our grandparents can go retire to, we don't have, nice other stuff. The Lakers went ahead opponent in the finals, and I'm using Laker colors again, so I got to give that shout out. But anyway, so we get the Adams-Onis Treaty, we get Florida for some land that Spain was about to lose anyway, so it worked out really, really well. And Adams does a great job of using the excuse essentially, hey, we can probably just take this from you if you want. So why don't you sell it to us and we'll give you some of this land in Texas. So that worked out really, really well. We already talked about Adams' involvement in the Monroe Doctrine. He was the chief architect or chief writer of the Monroe Doctrine. So when we talk about JQA, John Quincy Adams, we're talking about a very skilled politician and a very skilled diplomatic mind, very similar to his father. Okay, so now let's move on from that. Let's talk a little bit about the election of 1824, which is referred to as the corrupt bargain. So this might get a little dicey and confusing, so I'm going to do the best job I can to explain it to you. So the election process in 1824 was very different, and from 1824 and before. So now we have party conventions, and they nominate the candidate, and that's how it works. Prior to 1824, for 1824 and before, you wouldn't really have these big nominating conventions, especially now because the Democratic Republicans are really the only party. They're the only show in town. Okay, so in 1824, as we're kind of seeing some sectional disputes and disagreements in the country, we have 4 candidates for president. Okay, so we have 4 candidates for president. I'm going to write them down, and you're not going to be able to read them. So, of course, you got John Quincy Adams, got Andrew Jackson, got Henry Clay, and you have a man named William Crawford. So let's talk about all these guys for a second. So Crawford is a Southerner from Georgia. And he is what they call the caucus candidate. See, what would happen in every election is the party would get together, the Congress would get together, and the members of Congress, which at this point are all Democratic Republicans basically, would kind of hand-pick somebody to be the person that they think would be a great nominee for president. Okay? And that would be called King Caucus. And this had happened with the last several presidential elections, where they would nominate their candidate, and that would be the person that they would want. It had happened under Monroe, under Madison, ever since Jefferson. Okay, and the caucus candidate this time was Crawford. Okay, so all good there. Crawford is running on a campaign of states' rights. He's a big states' rights advocate. He's from Georgia. That makes sense. Then you have Henry Clay. Henry Clay is the nationalist candidate, okay? And he has this whole platform that he calls his American system, which we will come back to, I believe, in Chapter 10. And the American system of Henry Clay calls for 3 things. He's running a campaign where he's going to call for a stronger national bank. Write these down. A stronger national bank. Internal improvements, which basically means infrastructure, build new bridges, new roads, canals at this point, stuff like that, and a protective tariff. Now we know what a tariff is. That's a tax on goods imported or exported. A protective tariff is a tax on goods that are imported to the United States because it protects American goods to prevent people from buying foreign goods. Okay, like cars today, if you had a protective tariff on cars, we would put a big tax on any car, any like Toyotas and Hondas and cars coming in from foreign countries, so then people will buy, GM and Ford and other American cars. Okay, so hopefully that makes sense. So Clay has his American system. Again, that's a stronger national bank, internal improvements, infrastructure, and a protective tariff, and he calls it his American system. Then you have John Quincy Adams. John Quincy Adams is the obvious choice for president. He is the Secretary of State. The 3 previous presidents had been secretaries of state before they were president. That was the pathway to the presidency, not the vice presidency. If you wanted to be president, typically you are, before that, you are the Secretary of State. So Adams is what you'd call the obvious choice. He's a career politician. He's a guy that's in the Secretary of State. He's shown, through his foreign policy stuff that he knows what he's doing. He's the obvious choice. And then finally, you have Andrew Jackson. Andrew Jackson is really the people's candidate. He's a military hero. Um, he comes from Tennessee, so he's this big military guy, and is really popular as this hero of the War of 1812, and that's really going to catapult him politically. People look at him as our next George Washington in some sense. He won us the War of 1812, and people, of course, are really excited about that. So that's how it breaks down. You got the four candidates, and they all represent different regions of the country. Okay, and this is where it gets dicey. So you have the election. Okay, and of course it's very sectionalist. John Quincy Adams controls the New England, controls the Northeast. He splits kind of the mid-Atlantic states, so we're talking like Pennsylvania and New York and places like that. He kind of splits that with Jackson. Then Jackson and Crawford split the southern states, and then Jackson and Clay split the western states. So, Jackson's getting in there a little bit everywhere. Adams is getting a good amount of support, but everybody's got kind of some support. So what that results in is a disputed election. Okay? And this is where it becomes a corrupt bargain. So when they go to vote and determine things, poor old Henry Clay has the fewest votes, so he's kind of kicked out. And Clay makes a deal with Adams and says, make me your Secretary of State, and I will basically give you my support for the presidency. Okay? Which essentially means all of the electoral votes that Clay got will go to John Quincy Adams, which ultimately would give him enough to win the election. Okay? So hopefully that makes sense. So I'm going to skip over the questions here, and I'm going to show you the map, and hopefully that'll make a little bit more sense there. So hold on a second. So if you look at the map, this one here, from 1824, you see the state, John Quincy Adams up here, the Jackson's in the red, and he's a little bit everywhere. So what happens basically here is Clay gets kicked out. Okay, and what you have here with the popular vote percentage being 43, that's not a majority, that's what you call a plurality. There's also a plurality in the electoral vote. So what happens is Clay's 37 votes go with Quincy Adams' 84, giving him, what would that be, 94, 04, 17, 121 electoral votes to Jackson's 99. That's enough to win the presidency for John Quincy Adams. And of course, Andrew Jackson is really pissed. And if there's one thing you know about Andrew Jackson, he's not a guy you really want to make mad, because he will challenge you to a duel and he'll shoot you. Guy was in 8 duels. Most people, like I said, most people are only in 1, right? So, and you'll notice, and we'll talk about the 1828 election here in a minute, you'll notice 4 years later, the election's not as close. So you're wondering either John Quincy Adams did a really bad job as president, or Andrew Jackson was really, really popular. Okay? Well, let's get into that here now. So the election of 1828 and the reemergence of Andrew Jackson. So what we see in 1828 is a totally new party system. What people tend to call the second, some people call it the third, the second party system. So after 1824, a lot of people, the common man, champion Andrew Jackson, and he's their hero. Okay? So the Democratic Republicans kind of split, and those that support Andrew Jackson just start going by the name Democrats. And yes, this is the same Democratic Party that exists today, at least in name only. Policy-wise, they've changed quite a bit in 200 years. But the election of 1828 represents for us the birth of the modern election system. Okay, we now have 2 parties again. For the first time, we have conventions to elect the President of the United States. Um, the Democratic Republican Party is kind of dissolving and being in support of Jackson or Adams. So Adams supporters form their own party that they call the National Republican Party. This is really confusing because this is not the Republican Party of today. So this party no longer exists. This one is still around. Anyway, and this is a really, really dirty election. They call the election of 1828 one of the dirtiest and meanest and nastiest elections in American history. And then 2016 happened, and then 2020 happened. So we've had worse more recently. But we see a lot of political division. We see mudslinging on both sides, right? And mudslinging is basically throwing mud, so to speak, or saying bad things about your political opponent. And it got really, really, really dirty, okay? The Jackson people made claims about John Quincy Adams and said that, he was throwing extravagant parties in the White House where he and his cronies and buddies would come in and there'd be partying and drinking and gambling. They likened the White House, I think they said that, whenever Adams brought foreign dignitaries in from foreign countries, the White House became like a brothel and there would be prostitutes and stuff like that there. So they say all these horrible things about John Quincy Adams. Most of it was not true. There weren't crazy gambling, sex parties at the White House. That sort of thing wasn't happening. And the Adams people say about Jackson that, he's a murderer. He's shot and killed people in duels. The guy's a murderer. They also went after his wife, Rachel. They went after his wife, Rachel, and accused her of being what they called a bigamist adulterer, saying that she, cheated on her husband with Andrew Jackson. And, they say some really horrible things about her. Now, in reality, most of what Adams people said about Jackson was technically true. He had been in duels. He's confirmed to have killed at least 2 people in his lifetime in duels. He'd been shot a couple times in duels and survived. Okay, so yeah, he's killed people. All right, and his wife Rachel was not an adulterer, so to speak, but when she got together with Andrew Jackson, she was married to another guy, but in the process of getting a divorce or whatever. So from a technical standpoint, I guess she would be an adulterer, but really not a reason to kind of bring up and say such horrible things about someone's wife. And it was so bad that the stress of all the attention and all the things that they were saying about Rachel Jackson killed her. Like she actually died shortly after the election. And that's a big moment for Andrew Jackson. And we're going to find out in Chapter 9, how he felt about all these people that said horrible things about his wife and ultimately were responsible to some degree for her death. But in any event, even though most of the stuff that's said about Adams is false and a good amount of the stuff that's said about Jackson is true, in the election of 1828, Andrew Jackson wins. And he wins, as you noted from the slide, from the map on the previous slide, he wins, by a pretty wide margin. Okay, the big thing that killed John Quincy Adams was something called the Tariff of Abominations. So this was a tariff on goods that was the high point of U.S. tariffs, as much as 50% in some places. And this makes Southerners really, really mad. The goal of the tariff was to protect Northern industry. John Quincy Adams was a Northerner, so he supported the tariff. So protect Northern industry with taxes on imported goods. Of course, what we know about tariffs is if we put a tax on imported goods, foreign countries are going to do the same thing. So while this is good for Northern industry, it really hurts Southern farmers because it costs them a lot more as well. So they begin calling it the Tariff of Abominations and call this really abominable, horrible tariff that's devastating to a lot of people. And ultimately, that's what gives the win in the election to Andrew Jackson. Why is Andrew Jackson so popular? Andrew Jackson is the common man. Most importantly, he's a triumphant war hero. He won the Battle of New Orleans, so therefore, in the mind of the average American, he won the War of 1812. You, my friends, who are not the average American, and who hopefully listened when we were going through chapter 7, know that it wasn't really him who won the War of 1812. That war had already been won. It just happened at a really good time for him. And he comes out of the war a hero. He'd won the Seminole Wars and things of that nature, right? So, having the support of the common man, his chief supporters being the common man, are really, really important. And they love Andrew Jackson. Now, here's a question that you might get right, you might not. And I want you to answer this question for me. Shoot me an email with those responses. Why are they more powerful in 1828 than they were in 1800? And I did mention this to you once, but I'll mention it again. The common man voter is much more powerful in 1828 than they were in 1800 because the common man can now do something they couldn't do in 1800, and what is that? I'll wait for your response. Go for it. Mrs. McGady, do you know? The common man can now vote. Remember, at first in American history, the only voters were white male landowners. Well, now we've opened our mind to more voting and more people that can vote, and by 1824 and 1828, all white males that are of age and are citizens of the United States can vote. So therefore, they are more powerful in 1828 than they ever were before. By contrast, why is John Quincy Adams so popular, so unpopular? Well, because John Quincy Adams is a very educated man. He's a Northerner. He's not someone who really identifies as much with the common man, right? And we see that a lot in politics today. We saw candidates 4 years ago on the Republican side that, people looked at like they would have John Quincy Adams. They can't identify with. People, I guess, the common man or many people in America felt, that they could identify a lot more with Donald Trump because, who better to represent the needs of the common man in America than a Manhattan billionaire? So there you go. But that's what makes John Quincy Adams unpopular, is just that he doesn't resonate in the same way with the common man that Andrew Jackson does. All right? So, moving on. Next really important Supreme Court case we'll go through really quick. McCulloch v. Maryland. Sorry that's not on there fully. So the issue at hand in McCulloch v. Maryland is can states tax federal institutions such as the Bank of the United States? We should already know the answer to this. In fact, you answered this somewhat on your quiz. The answer, of course, is no, they cannot. Marshall says the power to tax is the power to destroy, and the states cannot be given the power to destroy the federal government. Therefore, they cannot tax federal institutions. Okay, and you don't have to write this down completely. You can paraphrase it, whatever, take a picture. As long as that's all right with Mrs. McGady, that's fine with me. The power to tax is the power to destroy. States cannot be given the power to destroy the federal government. Therefore, they cannot tax federal institutions. The questions here: how does this strengthen the power of the federal government at the expense of the states? And more importantly, why are decisions like this and Marbury v. Madison so important to the future of the U.S.? I will let you answer. You can pause it if people are writing and see who has an answer for that. And I will give you a response in a second. Pause. Okay. So if anybody answered that, basically what this means with 4 is when you establish a stronger national government, that's a less likely chance that that government is going to fail at some point. So the more that you strengthen the federal government, the better off it's going to be. Okay? And these are really important decisions because the stronger the courts make the federal government, the more likely this country is to survive in the long run because of its national strength. Nationalism, national strength, stuff like that. So, even though the states' rights people may be upset about these decisions, They're actually really, really essential if this country is going to make it and survive. All right. So what is the bottom line for Chapter 8? The era of good feelings, though short-lived, represents a period where the U.S. really began to come into its own. Nationalism was on the rise, and the direction of the country was positive. However, underlying issues of sectionalism begin to show the instability of the nation and will eventually result in civil war. We also see the end of the Democratic-Republican Party, and a new party system emerges under Andrew Jackson, and we see the Democrats, the modern Democrats of today, are born. At least modern Democrats, again, in name only, policy-wise, idealistically, they've changed a little bit. So that's it. I know this will take you a minute to write this down or whatever. So I'm going to go ahead and finish up now. You can pause it if you want to so everybody can get this finished up. Remember, I hope everybody has an awesome weekend. Hopefully we'll do Alter proud this weekend, bring home a state title. If not, I'm going to be really depressed on Monday. But, that's all right. Anyway, miss you guys, and don't forget to send me an email if you have any questions about the tests, all right? Have a good weekend. Be safe.